Ian Dale.
And a very warm welcome to the LBC Book Club. Now, today I'm joined by David Leigh, award-winning journalist. He works for The Guardian, and he's written, or co-written, a book called WikiLeaks, Inside Julian Assange's War on Secrecy. It's a very hastily produced book, published by Guardian Books. I got my copy last week. I think it is literally out now. Welcome to the programme, David.
Thank you.
It is an absolutely gripping read. I've spent most of the day reading it. And, I mean, some books you sort of plod through, but this reads like an absolute thriller. And you've been at the centre of all of the cables that have come through from WikiLeaks. You spent a long time in your house in Scotland, sort of ferreted away to go through a lot of them. It's one of the biggest media stories of the last 20 or 30 years, isn't it?
It's pretty enormous. It does seem to be. I mean, it's the biggest leak in history, and it does seem to be the biggest scoop in recent history as well in terms of newspaper events. And, yeah, we did put it together pretty quickly. We did it in about 3 weeks flat, actually, the writing. So that was, like, frighteningly fast. But so I'm pleased that you say it's a good read.
And I didn't see any spelling mistakes either, so that's always good for a hastily produced book. Now, your co-author, and before we go into the book, I wanted to say your co-author, Luke Harding, who's The Guardian's Moscow correspondent, he's apparently been thrown out of the country over the weekend, we've just learned. Just tell us a little bit about that.
Well, it's very dramatic and upsetting news. This is the first time a British journalist has actually been thrown out of Russia for more than a decade. Luke, as my co-author and our Moscow correspondent, wrote really some of the most sensational chapters in the book and some of the most sensational stories that we did about what the cables said about Vladimir Putin's Russia. And they said essentially that it was a mafia state, that basically the intelligence agencies were hand in glove with the mafia, and the whole state was a kind of criminal conspiracy. So when he headed back to Moscow after writing the book, they stopped him at the airport and flung him in a cell and deported him.
And his family is still there?
His family is still there, yes. I mean, they'll be leaving shortly now.
So, and this happened over the weekend?
This happened over the weekend, and we were trying to find out from the Foreign Office over the last day or so what exactly had happened and why they've done this. We didn't get much joy. So the news has just broken, really, publicly today.
Right, well, I mean, I suppose all words have consequences, and that was a very unfortunate consequence for Luke. Right, well, let's try and approach this right from the beginning. And by the way, if any of you would like to speak to David and ask him any questions about the whole WikiLeaks experience, and indeed what Julian Assange is really like, because I mean, this is a warts and all book, it has to be said. You don't paint a particularly glowing picture of Mr. Assange in many parts of the book. If you want to know more about this character, 0845 6060 973 is the number to call. You can text your question to 84850. You can email ian@lbc.co.uk or tweet @lbc973. When did the word WikiLeaks originally cross your mind for the first time, or cross your desk?
Well, WikiLeaks itself was started in operation about 2006, which is maybe 4 years ago. Really, nobody had heard of it until last year. It was a sort of niche player. They were a little wacky online group who got leaked documents from nobody quite knew where, and they used to put up screeds of them, and occasionally there'd be a good story in it. For example, at one point they got hold of a report about corruption in Kenya, and they put it up there, and it caused quite an uproar in the country. And I think if they hadn't done that, nobody would have been able to read that report. So, they were performing a bit of a public service, and they were getting a little bit of a reputation for being uncensorable. You couldn't stop them. We came across them on The Guardian, really, for the first time when we tried to put up some documents. We got leaked documents of our own about Barclays Bank and their tax avoidance schemes. And we posted them up on the Guardian website, and Barclays Bank got a judge woken up at 2 a.m. in his pyjamas to issue a gagging order and make us take them down again. They turned up on WikiLeaks, and nobody could find a way of taking them down. So they became a sort of unstoppable, uncensorable organisation. So that's what was going on. And then this year, it all exploded, and they moved from being a niche player, and Julian Assange, the founder, moved from being this sort of rather obscure Australian anarchist into a worldwide celebrity. And that's all blown up this year.
Because in a sense, I suppose they provided a service for whistleblowers, whether in governments or big companies, and they just received the documents and put them up. Isn't one of the problems with sites like this in that there's no sort of editorial judgment at all? They just put everything up lock, stock and barrel, and in a sense, although it didn't happen with the 3 million or so documents here, that's what he wanted to do.
Julian Assange founded WikiLeaks on a really completely different principle to conventional journalism. He said, you can leak stuff to me, you can upload stuff to me, or I can get hold of stuff somehow and upload it myself onto this website. Nobody can trace it, nobody can stop it, and I'm just going to dump it out on the world and people can make of it what they will. When he started, I think Julian had a rather naive idea that citizens out there, people would sift these documents and explain them and provide context and even say whether they were genuine or not, and they do all the work for him, like Wikipedia, which has got a similar name. Actually, none of that ever happened. And what he realised in the end was that he needed what he calls the mainstream media to work with him to actually make sense of this stuff and to publish it in a safe and sensible way. So we all formed this really quite remarkable partnership over the last year to publish the biggest leak in world history.
And when did you first become aware of the documents that he had? And when did you first know what he wanted to do with them?
I first met Julian, actually, nearly a year ago now in Norway at a journalist conference, and we were both there. I was speaking, he was speaking, and there was this tall, lean, silver-haired Australian, very excitable figure, really, and he buttonholed me and said, you've got to look at this. And he took me up to my hotel room. This is like 3 a.m, you know, we'd all been partying.
He does keep very odd hours. That's the running theme through the book.
He's nocturnal. He works at night and sleeps all day.
And what did you make of him?
He seemed a very unusual character, but more to the point, what he had in his computer, in his laptop, was the most amazing thing. And he showed me, he entered a lot of passwords in, and what came up was this video he'd got from an Apache helicopter showing them machine gunning civilians on the ground in Baghdad and killing the lot of them. And it was the most astonishing thing, the most shocking experience to watch that. And it turned out that what this was the cockpit video from an Apache gunship which had managed to kill, accidentally, 2 Reuters employees who were with a group of men in a Baghdad street. And Reuters themselves have been trying in vain to get hold of this under Freedom of Information requests for a long time and had failed. Julian had got this. He didn't tell me where he got it from, and eventually he played it to the world in a press conference in Washington and caused a considerable uproar. What happened next was that an army private, Bradley Manning, was arrested and put in a military cell where he's been ever since, and accused of being Julian's source. And accused of being his source not just for the helicopter video, but for a huge mountain of other documents. And those are the documents that WikiLeaks eventually turned over to us.
And I suppose we should explain that there are around 3 million of these documents. Now, not all of them have been put on the internet. But the other thing that I suppose is very shocking reading the book is that Bradley Manning, a 22-year-old, should have access to all of the security codes and information that allowed him to effectively download virtually every bit of American national security information that was available.
The history of this is very, very ironic. After 9/11, the American military establishment realised that they had reams and reams of data and nobody was sharing it with anybody else. And they thought if people had shared intelligence a bit more, then maybe they would have found out what was going on before 9/11 happened and before the Twin Towers were brought down. So they instituted a deliberate policy throughout the US administration that they were going to share these huge databases of information that they were accumulating. And one of the key things that they shared was many of the diplomatic cables, the secret diplomatic cables that the State Department, which is their equivalent to the Foreign Office, was sending from its embassies all over the world back to Washington. And they made these available to the US Army. And they made them available right down to very low level, so that a humble private, Bradley Manning, sitting in the desert in Iraq, was cleared to see secret material, and he could sit at his workstation and he could just call up these reams and reams of amazing stuff.
Astonishing, isn't it?
Well, it was well-intentioned, but I suppose they're going to stop it now.
Well, you'd like to think so. Well, maybe we wouldn't like to think so, but I mean, I suppose it must have made a few people in the Ministry of Defence sit up and think, oh my God, did we do this?
Well, there's a moral in all this, and the moral is that once, in the age of the internet, once you start accumulating these great big government databases, they're going to get leaked. Somebody's going to leak them, and it's not just about American military documents. I mean, for example, in Britain, they're making a huge database of everybody's medical records. Now, I mean, I think sure as anything that'll be leaked one day.
I think, isn't that being abolished? I thought they decided not to go ahead with that.
Well, if they don't go ahead with it, that'll be a good thing.
I totally agree with you. Well, you're listening to the voice of David Leigh, who's the co-author of this marvellous book, WikiLeaks, Inside Julian Assange's War on Secrecy. He's co-authored it with Luke Harding, The Guardian's, well, I suppose we have to say ex-Moscow correspondent now. It's published by Guardian Books, $9.99 in paperback. If you want a drama, a political drama, then read this book, because it is written in a really dramatic way. And we'll be talking about Julian Assange, the man, and the whole WikiLeaks story in a very short time. But it's now 9:15. And Alan Joyce has the travel.
Thanks, Ian. Well, some better news on the trains.
And you're listening to the LBC Book Club with me, Ian Dale, and David Leigh is with me. He's the Guardian's investigations and executive editor. That's a bit of a mouthful. And he's written a book with Luke Harding called WikiLeaks, Inside Julian Assange's War on Secrecy, which has been very hastily published, bearing in mind that we only really got the full the full story of WikiLeaks just before Christmas. David, when you first met Julian Assange and he wanted to get The Guardian involved in publishing the story, just tell us a bit about the negotiations that ensued then.
Well, it was more a case of The Guardian persuading Julian Assange that we should do a deal and get involved. And my colleague, Nick Davis, tracked him down in Brussels. He's a very nomadic character. He's always flitting from one country to another. He tracked him down there, and he spent several hours persuading him that it would be a really good idea to come in with us, that we would be his partners, and not just us. The way the deal evolved in the end was an amazing sort of multinational newspaper deal, because we got the New York Times in as well, and we got Der Spiegel magazine in Germany, and eventually the deal involved El País in Spain and Le Monde in Paris. So this was like 5 countries, an unprecedented newspaper collaboration.
And in a sense, it could have been a recipe for disaster with so many different people involved.
Well, it very nearly was.
That's what I was kind of alluding to. Well, just tell us, right, when the stuff was published, there was a problem with Der Spiegel in particular, wasn't there?
Well, there were 2 sets of problems. One is it's a pretty crazy idea to imagine that you can have a German weekly magazine, an American daily in a different time zone, and French and Spanish papers as well, all cooperating with a bunch of anarchists who were holed up in a stately home in the Norfolk countryside. And they would only communicate by encrypted chat line called Jabber. It was really a recipe for disaster, and disaster very nearly happened. The whole thing very nearly got derailed because everybody felt a quarrelling at a crucial stage in all of it. What happened there was that Julian Assange basically flew into a rage because the New York Times wrote a rather unflattering profile of him. And he decided he didn't like that, and he was going to cut the New York Times out of the deal. I decided then that if you've got a partner, you've got to stick with them. And I said, no, we're going to leave the New York Times in, and I'm going to give them these cables. I'm going to give them a copy. Julian actually flew into a huge rage then, and he marched into The Guardian, accompanied by his lawyer, and threatened that he was going to sue us for basically stealing his property. And
well, I suppose everyone saw the irony in that.
Well, that was the point at which the editor of Der Spiegel got to his feet, and he said, look, Julian, we're not quite sure who has title to this property, because it sort of belongs to the American government, really.
And, I mean, right at the last minute, copies of Der Spiegel appeared a day before they were supposed to.
Oh, well, this was the technical disaster, yes. Throughout all these arguments, Der Spiegel had actually been the peacemakers. They were the people who smoothed things over, because we patched all that up in the end and we got the show on the road again, and we all agreed to work all this out. And we all agreed a date. On November the 28th, on the Sunday night, when we were all 5 of us going to put this stuff out together. And we had the script all written, and Der Spiegel had arranged that they would postpone their normal publication for 24 hours. And something went terribly wrong, and a van arrived at a Swiss railway station in Basel 24 hours too early. It unloaded 30-40 copies of Der Spiegel with this screaming front page saying, "We've got these cables, we've got the entire American State Department's treasure chest here," and it had rows and rows of world leaders with rather rude things written about them that the Americans had written about them. And first of all, Basel radio station got hold of a copy and started broadcasting, and so they were frantically rung up and said, "Please stop." And then a tweeter, a computer enthusiast, bought one of the last remaining copies and started tweeting, "Hey, I've got a copy of Spiegel, it's out early with this amazing stuff." And he started scanning pages in and putting them up online. And we were just sitting there, several hundred miles away, watching this appalled as gradually the news started to seep out into the Twitter sphere and into the blogosphere. And we realised it just couldn't hold. And in the end, we just had to push the button and go early.
What is the public interest of publishing cables of conversations between ambassadors and their home governments? Because it struck me that there was obviously a public interest in publishing a lot of this material, but with a lot of it, wasn't it publishing it just because you could or because he could?
It's a very interesting question, because this was the debate we had at the time. We were presented with this huge mountain of confidential material. And what was the moral compass we were going to use, if you like, about what we should publish and what we shouldn't? And on the newspapers, we took some very definite decisions about what we would publish. We were only going to publish stuff that we thought it was in the public interest to know. So we've never published 250,000 cables. We've published a tiny fraction of those, a few hundred. We also decided very early on that we were not going to publish anything that would cause individuals to suffer reprisals. There are some of these countries, Russia, China, other post-Soviet regimes. You really don't want to be known that you've been talking to the Americans behind the back of your own regime. So we took a decision to take out every single name that would invite reprisals.
And Julian Assange didn't really agree with that, did he?
Not to start with,
Let me just read you from your book. His response to that was, well, they're informants, so if they get killed, they've got it coming to them. They deserve it. What was your reaction to that?
He did say that, and he did say that very early on, and the context in which he said that was with the very first batch of documents, which was the war logs, the military field reports from Afghanistan, which is a hot war that's still going on. And we, at that point, said, look, Julian, people could get killed, here, if they've been seen talking to the Americans. We have to take these names out. And he said this thing, that they're informants. If they get killed, they deserve it. There was a bit of a silence fell around the restaurant table at that point, and I think all the journalists present were pretty shocked. We thought Julian was being callous, and we also thought he was being very naive, because he didn't seem to understand how complicated it was in a war zone like Afghanistan. If armed men burst into your house and ask you questions, and you give them answers, what does that make you? It doesn't make you an informant. It makes you somebody just trying to get by, often. And also it was very naive, because if we'd stuck to that, if he'd let people be identified and killed in reprisal, then the whole reputation of this whole WikiLeaks enterprise of mass leaking of documents would have been in tatters. People would have wanted nothing to do with him. We would have wanted nothing to do with him.
Isn't the fact that, Julian Assange is an unstable lunatic, isn't he? He comes across as that in many parts of your book.
Well, we try to be fair-minded in the book. You know,
you don't always succeed, David.
Oh, if you think it's not fair-minded, I'm sorry, because we set out.
I'll tell you what. I mean, I don't know. You probably know. I wrote an article for the Mail on Sunday when all of this was coming out, and it was very critical about Assange. I mean, very, very critical. And I got a lot of abuse for it at the time. I have to say, everything I wrote, I completely stand by, because your book basically proves what I was saying was true in many ways, that he's an egotist. Yes, I'm sure he does believe in transparency and all the rest of it. He's got an anti-American agenda, and it's all about him in the end.
I don't know whether it's true that he's got an anti-American agenda. He just got hold of a lot of American stuff. You know, the previous year he got hold of a lot of stuff about corruption in Kenya and published that. I don't think that made him have an anti-Kenyan agenda. I think he's more got an anti-everybody agenda in a way, or anti-all establishments agenda. He's an anarchist, you know. He's a hacker at bottom. He's a computer hacker. That's his history.
But he's a hacker who's pretending to be a journalist and a publisher. And he's neither, is he, really?
Well, he's had a bit of a steep learning curve. You know, I mean, he started out as a hacker. Indeed, he got arrested and convicted in Australia as a teenager for hacking into various telephone systems there. Then he got this WikiLeaks idea, which is sort of a good idea, you know, and it's sort of he had an idea behind it of social justice. He got involved with a lot of activists, and I think he thought that, you know, the world could be made a better place. Unfortunately, I think his ego did get the better of him, and I also think, unfortunately, he never thought through the implications of a lot of what he was doing. You know, hence this rather naive idea you could just dump out everything and it wouldn't matter what happened. He's learned about some of those things. I'd like to be fair about this. You know, Julian's got a lot of flaws, and I think at bottom, you're right, it's all about himself, and that is a problem. But he's done something that's quite remarkable, and that if he hadn't done it, then somebody else would, because what this is all about at the end of it is the technology. The technology's changed. These giant databases in computers have come into existence, and when they do, they're shared, and when they're shared, they're leaked, and when they're leaked, they're published. And this is the new world we're in.
It is, and it's an uncontrollable world, which in many ways is great, because it's exciting and lots of new things can happen. You're listening to the LBC Book Club with me, Ian Dale, and David Leigh, the author of WikiLeaks, or co-author of WikiLeaks, Inside Julian Assange's War on Secrecy. We'll be talking to David more about Julian Assange's extradition hearing today after the news.
LBC 97.3.
Topsy-turvy. Going back to the main question about the cables, take us through the process that you went through on The Guardian, because I'm quite interested to see how you made the decisions as to what should be redacted, sort of, which for those not in the know, I suppose after MP expenses, we all know what that means, but sort of where you blank out somebody's names. What process did you go through? Because you couldn't have had all of the information at your fingertips to be able to make those judgments.
We've got a lot of expertise on The Guardian, and we were one of 5 papers with between us. We had a formidable amount of expertise. You know, and we flew people back, like my co-author Luke Harding. We flew him back from Moscow and said, "You're the Russia expert. You know, tell us what we should put in here, what we should leave out." We flew back our Pakistan correspondent, Declan Walsh, who's vastly experienced. We used people who'd been out in Iraq, in Afghanistan, who were seasoned war correspondents. We relied on our own people who know a lot to tell us what we should leave out.
And how did you do this? Because it was such a massive amount of material. I mean, you're a journalist. You're not a techno geek. How did you, first of all, keep it all within the knowledge of a restricted number of people? And what technology did you use to go through it all?
Well, we journalists, you're right, we're not techno geeks, and we ended up feeling pretty stupid some of the time because we just didn't know how to handle all this stuff. We got it. It was in an encoded file, and we eventually found out how to decrypt it. And it's all on a little memory stick, you know, 250,000 files, which is enough for a room full of 2,000 books, all on a tiny little memory stick that I would just clip into my top pocket. We, first of all, it came as a sort of spreadsheet, and we didn't understand about spreadsheets, and for a lot of the time we didn't realise that we'd actually only, for various technical reasons, only got half the documents in front of us, and then after about 5 days somebody said, "Look, you know, you're missing a whole lot of stuff," and we had to go off to the techie people and say, "Please help us." And the techie people helped us, and in the end they built a database for us, and we could search those cables, for example, so that we could search them from a particular embassy or a particular date or particular keyword. So we'd put in words like Megrahi, for example, who was the Libyan intelligence officer who was released because he was supposedly dying, about which all the fuss continues. And we discovered then, when we pulled up, there'd be 400 cables referring to Megrahi. We then discovered the real story, which we were then able to publish in The Guardian. And the real story was that Colonel Gaddafi had been making what the Americans called thuggish threats to the British, that they would cancel all our commercial interests and they'd make us really sorry if Megrahi ever died in prison. And the British government was so terrified, they ensured...
You mean the Libyan government? I think you just said the American government.
Oh, no, the British government was so terrified.
No, but the Libyans were threatening them.
Oh, the Libyans were threatening.
I think you said the Americans.
Oh, well, forgive me for that. It's the Americans who were threatening Julian Assange. It's the Libyans who were threatening the British.
And on al-Megrahi, was there anything? I mean, we've seen the news today where the Labour government are accused of doing everything they possibly could to facilitate his release. Were there any cables that shed any light on that?
Well, absolutely. The cables showed that there were a series of reports from the British ambassador out there in Tripoli saying, look, if you let Megrahi die in prison, the Libyans are going to cut us off at the knees. Not only are they going to cancel all contracts, there are probably going to be demonstrations against us. Embassy personnel are going to be at risk. It'll be a nightmare. And that comes out over and over again in the cables.
What about the security precautions that you took? Because here you have potentially one of the biggest journalistic coups in decades. You clearly don't want your rivals to have any whiff of it. What precautions do you implement in that sort of situation? And were you worried that there were, as someone might say, dark forces out there, maybe governmental forces, maybe international governmental forces, who were well aware of what you were up to?
We had very strict instructions from Julian Assange right from the off about these cables. He said, if I turn these over to you, you've got to promise that you will not put them on any computer that's exposed to the internet, because if it is, then, the CIA and the NSA and all these secret agencies will be able to get their hands on them. And he said, you've got to understand as well that these cables are worth millions of dollars to foreign intelligence agencies, so they'll all be trying to eavesdrop on you. And he terrorised us all, really, into behaving in a very secure fashion, as we thought. And at one point, we even bought a batch of 20 pay-as-you-go phones, so that nobody would know the numbers and we could all communicate with each other in a secret squirrel way.
And it didn't really work, did it? Your colleague Ian Katz, I think, said that you were completely useless at this sort of thing.
I'm afraid journalists, we go down the pub and talk. We're not really secret agents, and we can't keep it up for very long.
Did you ever feel that the CIA might be monitoring your every move?
I thought that the CIA and MI5 weren't doing their jobs if they weren't monitoring our every move. But I also thought that it didn't matter, really. It's like thinking about your phone being tapped, All right, so people are tapping your phone. What are they going to do about it? And all right, so they knew we got these cables. What were they going to do about it? They really couldn't stop us. They were in too many hands, in too many jurisdictions. And eventually the American State Department recognized that, I think, and the truth is that they decided not to come after us, but to rather discreetly engage with us and say, look, guys, if you're really going to do this, we hate it, but would you please, not endanger individuals? And we said, yes, we're not going to do that.
We'll come on to that in a second. You're listening to the LBC Book Club with me, Ian Dale, and David Leigh. If you have a question for David on any aspect of the WikiLeaks story, if you want to know a little bit more about Julian Assange, maybe you got a question that I haven't asked him yet, 0845 6060 973. That's the number to call. You can text us on 84850, email ian@lbc.co.uk, or tweet me at LBC973. The time now is 9:45. And you're listening to the LBC Book Club with me, Ian Dale, and David Leigh, the co-author of WikiLeaks, Inside Julian Assange's War on Secrecy. It's published by Guardian Books, $9.99 in paperback. And it's got some of the cables in it. It's not dominated by the cables. Most of it is the story of how this astonishing story came to public attention. And David, we were talking a few minutes ago about the American reaction. And there's a fascinating phone call that you took part in, or certainly Alan Rusbridger did, with the US State Department. And there were there was, I think, Assistant Secretary of State from the State Department, someone from the Department of Defence there. And just take us through how that conversation went.
Yeah, I was at that conference, yes. There were CIA people there, State Department people, all kinds of weird intelligence people. I don't think we got introduced to everybody.
I thought it was a phone call.
It was a phone call.
Oh,
yeah, but, they said, here is so-and-so, here is so-and-so. And the call was led by P.J. Crowley, who was the Assistant Secretary for Public Affairs, who is the public face of the State Department. And, we called them up. Alan Rusbridger, my editor, was asked to call them, and he did. And it was a very strange conversation, as you can imagine. They were, I suppose, seething with suppressed frustration is the best way to describe it, because, I suppose really they wanted to wring our necks, but they could recognise that the game had got out of their control. And we agreed to have a conversation on an off-the-record basis, so I'm not going to go into exactly what was said, but they made clear that they thought what we were doing was terrible. We'd stolen all their classified material. It was going to have a grave impact on American national security. And we said, yeah, you're right, but we're going to be nice. We're going to play nice. We're not going to endanger individuals. We are going to redact names, and we're prepared to listen to you if you've got things that you're particularly concerned about. And they mentioned a few things, and then they said, but look, we're just telling you everything we're worried about. We're just giving you stories, so we're going to stop all this. And are you going to tell us which cables you're going to publish or not? And we said, well, we don't think we're going to do that.
No. And was there any contact with the White House at all?
No, it was all done through the State Department. This was Hillary Clinton's private office that were there.
And what about the legal implications of this? Because in theory, The Guardian could have been under enormous legal pressure on this, and yet that didn't happen in the end, did it?
We spent a lot of time thinking about the legal situation. One of the reasons why we were happy to collaborate with the New York Times, and indeed with the other foreign papers, was that we thought something that's published across all these jurisdictions, they can't stop any of us. And we were afraid, to tell you the truth, that if the Guardian just went ahead alone and published this stuff, it would be very easy for the US Embassy to go to the British courts, wake up another judge in his pyjamas.
Well, particularly because of our libel laws, I
Because
guess.
of our libel laws and our laws about confidence, and we think they'd have slapped an injunction on us in no time.
Now, the man that really started this off, Bradley Manning, this 22-year-old private, he's now in a jail in Virginia. And you describe the conditions that he's living in, and they're fairly horrific by British standards.
I think it's absolutely horrific what's happening to him. It seems to be near torture, really. He's in a single cell. He's not allowed to talk to anybody. His guards won't converse with him. He's woken up at 5 a.m. He's not allowed to go to sleep again for the rest of the day. If he does, they wake him up. Every 5 minutes, they demand to know if he's okay. He has to answer. If he tries to exercise, they forcibly stop him. When he's allowed to go to sleep, if he turns over so the guards don't see him, they wake him up and say, are you all right? All of this is presented as being what they call a prevention of injury order, i.e. that to make sure he's not harming himself. But that's a sort of legalistic, cruel trick. What's really going on is that they're punishing him. These harsh conditions are designed to break his spirit and maybe designed to make him implicate Julian Assange in some kind of conspiracy.
What you're effectively describing is a form of torture.
It's exactly a form of torture, and I think it's actually quite evil what's happening to him. Just
as well America isn't signed up to the European Court of Human Rights, isn't it? Because I don't think there'd be votes for prisoners in America, would there? Now, what is there to come? We've had so much so far, but there's 3 million documents out there. You've presumably squirreled away quite a lot that still haven't come out.
Well, we've got 250,000 cables, and we've published a few hundred of them, so yes.
And you still have a team working through them even now?
No, we don't. We've pretty well worked through the first layer, as it were. There are some long-term projects that we're working on now. I mean, obviously, there's somebody who can write a PhD. There's somebody who can write a book about American foreign policy out of those cables. But we're a news organisation. We've taken the news out of it, and now the sort of wiki crumbs, as we call them, have been given to other newspapers like the Daily Telegraph to rummage around in.
Well, because Mr. Assange, he's kind of fallen out with The Guardian now, hasn't he? And he's seeking new friends, and the Daily Telegraph seemed to be his new busy mate.
Yes, the Telegraph seemed to be his new best friend, and I hope it lasts for them, but history suggests that none of his friendships last forever.
No, I mean, he's fallen out with your colleague Nick Davis. I'm not quite sure whether, well, I suspect after this book, maybe you've fallen out with him too?
Yes, I've fallen out with him. He's said some pretty rude things about me.
Well, go on, share.
Well, he had one of his supporters write that I was Salieri to his Mozart. Salieri was the talentless composer who tried to poison Mozart because he was so jealous of him.
Yes. I mean, do you find it hypocritical that he promotes such total openness, total transparency, and yet he's an incredibly secretive individual, isn't he?
I think basically he doesn't know what he's talking about. You know, he's got some rather simple-minded ideas. He started out as a teenage hacker, and hackers are people who, they're a function of the internet age. What they like to do is to break into other people's computers and eavesdrop and purloin all the information. That's basically what he's still about.
And what's the future for WikiLeaks, do you think?
That's the question that everybody's asking. What's the future for Julian Assange personally? Because he is WikiLeaks, really. If he gets extradited to Sweden, and I don't know, he gets convicted or he gets acquitted of these sex charges, will WikiLeaks flourish or die without him? I don't know. There are a host of imitators now, because he had an idea, and he was the first one with that. He is a pioneer. But others are now springing up, they say. And his former lieutenant, Daniel Domscheit-Berg, for example, has now set up a rival organisation called OpenLeaks, and I'm sure he won't be the last.
He sold, or he's done a publishing deal, and I think he's being paid something like £1.6 million for his memoirs. I just wonder whether people will buy it, because he's not a particularly sympathetic character. I mean, whether you agree with him on what he's done or not, he's not someone that makes you think that you rather like him. And I think if you're going to read somebody's autobiography, you kind of want to, unless they are a very evil person, you want to read something about someone that you at least have some sort of empathy with.
Well, Julian Assange has got a huge fan base out there across the whole world. There are probably thousands of adoring people, many of them youngsters, who think that Julian is the bold outlaw of the internet age. He's the sort of Robin Hood, or he's the Ned Kelly in Australia. He's the bandit, the outlaw. He's the man who makes governments tremble, and they like that. It's only the people who get really close up to Julian who begin to wonder whether he's so nice.
That's a bit of an indictment, isn't it? Just finally, a word about transparency, because I think freedom of information is a good thing. I think most people would agree. Maybe Tony Blair wouldn't agree with it, but I think most people think that's a good thing. Transparency, we all think that's a good thing. But it's so difficult to define where the limits should be, because none of us, surely, even Julian Assange, can believe in total transparency on everything.
Well, I've been campaigning as a journalist for freedom of information all my professional life. And in fact, the very first book I wrote, which is like many years ago now, was about freedom of information, and I called it The Frontiers of Secrecy. And I said the whole issue is, where do you draw the line on the frontiers of secrecy? You know, what's this side of the line, which is like our privacy and things that ought to be kept secret, and what's the other side of the line, things we should know about. And I do believe there are a lot of things that we should know about that our governments do. And in fairness to Julian, he has done an extraordinary thing in putting before us a huge mountain of stuff about the way the world works and the way our governments work that we didn't know before.
Well, David, it's been an absolute pleasure to read your book today and to talk to you and get a bit better insight into Julian Assange, who is one of the phenomenons of our time, I guess. Thank you very much for joining us on the programme tonight. Next week, I'll be talking to the best-selling novelist Michael Dobbs. He's got a new novel out, but we'll, of course, be talking about The House of Cards as well, which is probably his most famous work. Now, coming up next on LBC 97.3 is Clive Bull. I'll be back with you tomorrow at 7.